Welcome to True Tears Stories. Please like this video and subscribe to True Tears Stories. I hope you enjoy the story. Let's begin. Richard had always believed that generosity would buy him grace. Not admiration, not affection, but a kind of earned comfort, a seat at the table, a steady warmth in the eyes of those he loved. That's what he told himself when he wrote the first check for the wedding, and the second, and the third. He told himself it wasn't about being noticed, but when the day came, he noticed everything. The venue was stunning. High windows that poured golden light onto polished floors. White flowers curled around every banister. Soft jazz drifting from a string quartet tucked beneath a blooming trellis. It was the kind of wedding that looked like it had fallen out of a magazine. He'd made it possible. But the moment he stepped inside, he felt the air shift around him. No one rushed to greet him. No one even looked twice. He walked slowly past clusters of guests in pastel suits and champagne dresses. He recognized most of them from the engagement party last fall. Friends of the groom's parents, mostly. They nodded politely, some gave tight smiles, but no one reached out. It was like being inside someone else's dream. Beautiful, but not quite his. Richard looked for his daughter, Samantha. She was somewhere in the chaos of hairpins and lace, of photographers and bridal attendants. He knew better than to try and find her before the ceremony. That's what the planner had said. Let her have her calm. He'd nodded then. He didn't want to be the problem, so he kept walking. He greeted the groom's parents with practiced warmth. Robert and Dana. They were sharp, well-tailored people who'd always seemed slightly amused by Richard's presence. When Dana air-kissed his cheek, she didn't make eye contact. Robert shook his hand a beat too short. You look well, Richard offered. Busy, Robert said. This place took some doing. But it's come together, hasn't it? Richard nodded, his smile frozen. Yes, it's beautiful. Dana's eyes flicked down the hall. Well, we should go check on the caterers. You know how tight the timeline is. They turned before he could respond. Richard stood in the hallway alone for a moment longer, then headed toward the reception hall. The seating cards were arranged on a long wooden table, each nestled in a silver frame beside a tiny eucalyptus sprig. He scanned for his name. Not in the center, not on either end. Finally, he saw it. Table 9. He blinked. Table 9? He checked again. The card read, Mr. Richard Whitaker, family friend, family friend. At first, he assumed it was a misprint, a strange oversight. He looked again. Read the name 3 times, like maybe it would rearrange itself into something less absurd. But it didn't. And the more he looked, the more it began to feel deliberate. Table 9 wasn't close to the dance floor. It was in the far corner, nearly tucked behind a pillar, near the exit to the bathrooms. He walked slowly toward it, scanning the other cards along the way. He saw names he barely recognized in better seats. Co-workers of the groom, extended family from the bride's mother's side. Not one family friend label among them. He sat down at the empty table and folded his hands. Around him, other guests trickled in. He smiled at a couple who approached, but got only a distracted nod in return. They didn't introduce themselves. He didn't push. Somewhere in the distance, he heard the beginning of the procession music. Applause broke out, and everyone stood. Richard stood too, craning his neck. He caught a glimpse of Samantha at the end of the aisle, radiant in lace and pale blush, her arm looped through Robert's. Robert's. It took him a breath to register that. Robert was walking her down the aisle. No one had told him. No one had asked. Richard's smile didn't falter, but his fingers curled around the edge of the table. He didn't cry. He didn't flinch. But something in his chest shifted, like the slow cracking of ice underfoot. He watched the ceremony from his corner seat. He clapped in all the right places. He toasted with sparkling cider when the glasses were passed around. And when the bride and groom kissed, he stood and cheered just loud enough not to sound silent. Afterward, when the dancing began and the room shifted into laughter and music, Richard stayed seated. He tried not to think about the words printed on that place card, but he couldn't stop seeing them. Family friend. Richard stayed at table 9 long after the salad plates had been cleared. The conversation swirled around him like music from another room, near enough to hear, but never quite close enough to join. He smiled when people made eye contact, nodded when servers passed by, raised his glass out of habit when the best man gave a toast. But inside, he felt like furniture. Present, polite, ignored. From his seat near the column, he could see Samantha moving between tables, her veil now pinned back, her eyes bright with the day's chaos. She laughed easily, hugging relatives, posing for pictures. She didn't glance toward him once. Richard found himself waiting, at first for acknowledgement, then simply for eye contact. But it never came. He wasn't angry, not exactly. He felt outside, like something had shifted without him noticing, and now he couldn't find the moment when it happened. Samantha had always been independent, strong-willed even as a child. But they'd had a bond, hadn't they? Movie nights and inside jokes, long walks when she was little, her hand always tucked into his. He remembered a time when she cried after scraping her knee and only wanted him, not her mother, to bandage it, but somewhere along the way, things had narrowed. College brought distance, then the divorce, then the silence. When she got engaged, he tried to be supportive, wrote a check without flinching, asked if she needed help with the venue, the band, the flowers. She'd said, "You're sweet, Dad. Don't stress." And that had been that. He didn't expect fanfare, but he hadn't expected this either. He was still seated when the photographer came by to organize the family portraits. He watched them shuffle people toward the side garden. The groom's parents went first, then cousins, aunts, uncles. He saw Samantha gesture to someone, her hand slicing through the air like a director calling cues. Then she paused. Their eyes met, across the room. Richard gave a small wave. She held his gaze for a beat, then turned away. He waited to be called, waited for someone to wave him over, to say, "We need one with her dad." But the photographer packed up without a word, and the guests returned indoors. No one had noticed him missing from the album. Later, when the music softened for the first dance, Richard stood quietly near the bar, holding a glass of water like it was wine. He watched Samantha and her new husband sway under fairy lights, her head on his shoulder, the room bathed in gold and laughter. There were cheers, flashes of cameras, and then more guests spilled onto the floor. Then came the father-daughter dance. The band shifted to a slower tune, something old-fashioned, with strings and soft piano. Robert stepped forward, took her hand. The room applauded as they moved into the circle. Richard's chest tightened. He felt something rise in his throat and pressed it back down. He didn't make a scene, didn't speak, just stepped back into the shadow of the pillar and sat down again at table 9. He didn't cry, not then, but something inside him folded, quietly. When the night wore on and the cake had been cut, he went outside for air. The sky was cool, the garden lit with scattered lanterns. He found a bench near the koi pond and sat in the hush. A voice startled him. "Mr. Whitaker?" He turned. It was Emily, the bride's childhood friend, now grown, now elegant in soft green silk. She was holding her shoes in one hand, barefoot on the gravel path. "I saw you outside and wanted to say hi," she said. Richard managed a smile. "You clean up well." "So do you," she said, then tilted her head. "You okay?" "I'm fine." She hesitated. "You know, when I was 15 and my parents split up, you were the first adult who didn't treat me like glass. You told me I'd be okay, that I could still build something new." He smiled, the memory unexpected. "Did I say that?" "Yeah. I think about it all the time." She lowered her shoes. "I know tonight might have felt strange, but you made this happen. The wedding, the dress, the everything. And I think she knows that, even if she doesn't know how to say it." Richard looked back toward the glowing windows. Inside, Samantha was twirling in her gown, her hair loose now, mouth wide in laughter. He tried to find comfort in Emily's words, tried to believe that presence counted more than title, but the card still sat in his coat pocket. Family friend. "Thanks, Emily," he said quietly. "That means a lot." She nodded once, then disappeared into the house. Richard sat a while longer, alone in the garden, listening to music drift across the lawn. He hadn't expected gratitude, but he hadn't expected erasure either. And yet, here he was. The wedding was 3 weeks ago, but Richard still hadn't unpacked the suit. It hung limp in the corner of his closet. The edges of the dry cleaning bag curled at the bottom, like it had given up trying to keep things crisp. Every time he reached for something in the closet, his raincoat, a sweater, it rustled faintly. A reminder. He hadn't spoken to Samantha since. No thank you. No follow-up call. Not even a text with a picture from the reception. Just silence, like the whole thing had folded itself into a chapter he wasn't invited to reread. At first, he thought maybe she was just overwhelmed. Honeymoon, post-wedding exhaustion, the usual whirlwind. But then he saw the photos. A tagged album from her new sister-in-law, dozens of pictures filled with joy, dancing, clinking glasses. And there, in the center of the family photo, Robert, beaming beside Samantha. Her arm looped through his. The caption read, "A perfect night with the perfect father." Richard closed his laptop slowly, then pushed it aside. He didn't even know how to be angry. He just felt heavy. He tried distracting himself, tackling the hedge out back, organizing the garage, even calling up his old college roommate to meet for coffee. But nothing really helped. Not because of the title, not because of the dance, but because of what it said about where he stood in her life now. She had replaced him. Or worse, he'd already been replaced. and the wedding had just been the moment he finally saw it. The only person who noticed was his neighbor, Nora, a widow in her late 70s who had a habit of gardening in floppy hats and always brought over more tomatoes than he could use. "You've been walking like the mail weighs more," she said one afternoon, handing him a basket of fresh rosemary and cucumbers. "Something you need to talk out?" He chuckled, tried to wave it off. But Nora wasn't the type to let things slide. She folded her arms and looked at him like she used to look at weeds. "You look like a man who gave everything and came home empty," she said. Richard didn't answer. "I've seen that face before," she added. "Mine made it for years." That night, after dinner, Richard sat at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and opened his laptop again. He didn't go to social media this time. He opened a folder on his hard drive labeled Samantha Childhood. Inside were scanned drawings, birthday cards, a video of her riding her bike for the first time. Her tiny voice shouting, "Daddy, look," as he ran behind her. Another clip from a school recital, her spotting him in the crowd and grinning so wide she missed her next line. She had needed him once, not just financially, emotionally, fully. And maybe he hadn't always done it perfectly. Maybe after the divorce, there had been weekends missed or calls delayed. But he'd tried. He'd shown up. So why didn't that count? He scrolled until he found one particular photo. Samantha, about 8 years old, sitting on his shoulders, at a fair, cotton candy in one hand, the other buried in his hair. Both of them laughing at something just outside the frame. He stared at that image for a long time. Then he opened a blank email. He didn't plan to send it. Just write. Let it out. Subject: Table 9. Body: I paid for the wedding because I believed in you. I stood at the back of the room and watched the girl I raised become a woman I didn't recognize. You called another man to the dance floor. You gave him the title without the years. And I sat there, wondering if maybe I had just imagined the way you used to look at me. But I didn't. I remember the scraped knees and school projects, the bedtime songs and late-night fears. I was there. You may not have seen me in the photos, but I was in the foundation, and I still am. He stared at it, then deleted the last line and rewrote it. I was in the foundation, and maybe that's where I'll stay, quiet, unseen, but still holding you up. He saved the draft, didn't send it, and somehow that felt like enough, for now. On Sunday morning, Richard took the long way to the bakery. It was the same route he used to walk with Samantha when she was little, past the duck pond, down the hill by the library, past the old corner store that had been turned into a boutique cafe with a name he couldn't pronounce. The neighborhood had changed, but the sidewalk still remembered the rhythm of their steps. He didn't know what he was looking for. Maybe a memory strong enough to anchor him. Maybe just the comfort of repetition. But as he walked, his thoughts didn't feel softer. They felt clearer. When he reached the bakery, the bell above the door jingled the way it always had. He ordered 2 pastries, just out of habit. He used to get one for Samantha to take home after their walks. This time, he tucked the second one into his coat pocket. Back home, the house felt still. The kind of still that pressed in on you, not the kind that soothed. He set the pastries on the table and opened the windows to let the autumn air in. He wasn't sure what made him do it, curiosity or some slow-building urge, but he walked into the spare bedroom, the one that had once been hers. He hadn't touched it much in years, not since she'd officially moved in with her mom during high school. The posters were long gone, the twin bed covered in boxes now, but the built-in shelves still held relics. A snow globe from Yellowstone, a paint-stained teddy bear, a row of Nancy Drew books, and a photo frame, tipped on its side behind a stack of yearbooks. He pulled it out gently. It was a photo of the two of them at the science fair in 6th grade. Samantha beaming, her volcano model erupting with pink baking soda lava. Richard beside her, laughing in a way he didn't even recognize in himself anymore. There, in the corner of the frame, was a tiny post-it note in her handwriting. For Dad, the one who helps me blow things up the right way. He sank into the desk chair, the photo cradled in both hands. He hadn't remembered that note. He hadn't remembered that day being anything more than a blur of glue sticks and plastic volcanoes. But she had remembered it. It had mattered. And suddenly, he didn't feel erased, just distant, set aside, a part of her past, even if not her present. That night, after a slow dinner, Richard did something that felt both necessary and impossible. He called her. The line rang twice before her voice answered, brisk and surprised. "Dad?" "Hey," he said softly. "Got a minute?" She hesitated. Yeah, sure. What's up?" There were 1,000 ways he could have started, 1,000 things he could have said, but he chose the quietest one. "I saw the photos from the wedding." "Oh." Her voice tightened. "Yeah, I meant to reach out." "It's okay," he said quickly. "I just wanted to ask something." A pause. "Why didn't you tell me? About the dance? About the place card?" She was quiet for so long he thought maybe the line had dropped. Finally, she said, "I didn't know how." "Why?" "Because I didn't want to hurt you." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You didn't want to hurt me, so you pretended I didn't exist?" "No," she said, too fast. "No, it wasn't that. It's just, Robert's been there for a while now, and I didn't want to make it messy. He helped pay for things, too. It felt easier to include him." Richard exhaled, "But I wasn't just included. I was minimized." "I know," she said quietly, "and I'm sorry." He let that hang there. He wasn't sure if it was enough, but it was something. "I found a note you wrote," he said after a moment. "From your science fair. You called me the one who helps you blow things up the right way." She laughed, surprised. "I don't remember writing that." "Well, you did." Another silence, but this one felt different. "I do remember that day," she said. "You stayed up late helping me build it. Mom didn't get it, but you did." "I always tried to show up," he said softly. "I know." They sat in that pause together, the line between them no longer sharp, but gently blurred. A space between two people trying to remember how to speak to each other without past weight dragging every word. "Do you want to come by next weekend?" she asked. "It doesn't have to be a big thing, just lunch." He smiled, even though she couldn't see it. "Yeah, I'd like that." They didn't talk much more after that, but when he hung up, the house didn't feel as still. The suit was still hanging in the closet. But he didn't avoid it this time. He touched the sleeve, then turned away. Maybe he wouldn't be front and center in the photo album. Maybe he'd never be the one introduced at parties with pride. But he would be the one who stayed. The one who remembered the small things. The one who, when everything else was blurred or messy, had quietly helped build the ground she stood on. And sometimes that had to be enough. Some endings aren't sharp. They don't snap like branches or scream for resolution. Some endings arrive like dusk, quiet, slow, and hard to notice until the light has changed. For Richard, this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about reclaiming a title or demanding a rewrite of the roles he'd been given. It was about something more honest, accepting the reality that sometimes people you love rearrange you in their memory to suit their story, and sometimes you're left outside the frame of the picture you helped make possible. But what mattered now wasn't the seat at the reception or the name on a card. It was the small invitation extended after truth had been named. It was the note from long ago, buried behind dusty books, that reminded him he hadn't imagined the closeness. He hadn't hallucinated the bond. It had been real. It was real. And even if life had moved her in new directions, there was still space to walk beside her, now and again, in the shape of something new. Maybe it wouldn't look the way it used to. Maybe it wouldn't come with thank yous or acknowledgement from others. But it didn't need to, because love doesn't always come with fanfare. Sometimes it shows up as a lunch invitation after too long apart. Sometimes it sounds like your daughter's voice calling you dad again, without hesitation. Sometimes it's a photo from a science fair rediscovered on a Sunday morning. And sometimes it's just the steady decision to keep showing up even when it hurts, not because you were told you were good enough, but because you chose to be.